you that are here. The foundation, our chapter serves Los Angeles, Orange, San Bernardino, Santa Barbara, Ventura, Kern, and San Luis Obispo counties, as well as the lovely state of Hawaii. We have over 220,000 patients that we serve and support. And during this year, Crohn's and Colitis Awareness Week, we are so grateful to have all of you joining us tonight and helping us make IBD visible. Millions of Americans live with Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, and from December 1st to the 7th, the Foundation designed a very special program this week to bring together this IBD community around one shared goal: to raise awareness and educate the public about IBD as part of our mission to raise awareness and educate the public about a future free of Crohn's and colitis. We will be hearing from some fantastic speakers today, and it is my pleasure to be introducing you to the first speaker of the program tonight, Gary Hirschhorn. He is our South Bay support group facilitator, and Gary has been doing such incredible work in leading our support group for almost 30 years. And I can't wait for you to hear more about his story and how much the South Bay support group has done to improve the quality of life for so many patients and their loved ones. So I'm going to turn it over to Gary to share his story.
Hi, hi everyone. As Tiffany said, my name is Gary Hirschhorn. I'll give you a little bit of the journey I had to where I am now. When I was a senior in college, I was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis. I was living in New York at the time, and I got sick pretty quickly. I was on high doses of steroids, but I was holding down a job. I graduated, held down a job, and my mom had mentioned something about a sport group, and I said I wanted nothing to do with it. And in my mind, it was something that a bunch of really sick people lying around this complaining was what that was about. But about a year later, I had gotten I wasn't feeling well, and I was on a business trip to Chicago, and everyone else was at the bar, and I was just up in my room, and I called my mom. I'm ready to go to the group now. And I couldn't have been more wrong about my impressions. I showed up at the group, the support group in New York, and I found, unlike my expectations, there was a bunch of people just like me, holding down jobs, students, parents, kids, just everyone from different walks of life, looking normal, and people were not, depressed and just complaining. They were trying to make do, and it was quite energizing, quite uplifting once a week to be able to be with people who knew exactly what I was going through and was in the same situation, and it really changed my life in so many good ways. And so I was in New York for a couple of years. I unfortunately didn't get better, but I did have the support groups. And then when I moved to Los Angeles, I happened to run into the head of the CCFA, or the CCFA at the time, and I was at a party. It's a social event, and she mentioned that we needed they needed a facilitator for the South Bay, and I was living there, and so I said I'd be happy to do it. That was almost 30 years ago, and since then we've been meeting monthly, and it's really just been a wonderful experience. The experience I had from New York continued here. Just meeting a lot of great people who often come just not knowing what to expect, but almost always, in my experience, come out of it happy, and especially the feeling of being with other people who know exactly what you're going through, and you don't have to explain, and you can laugh and cry, and some of the things that are just horrific to the outside world, you can laugh about as painful as, because you have to laugh sometimes, and there's support, and so just wanted to share that, and I'm glad the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation has given me the opportunity to do this help, and I look forward to doing it more. Tiffany?
Thank you so much, Gary. And now I'm so excited to introduce to you Lauren Cornell, who's our speaker for this evening. Lauren is a member of our dedicated healthcare provider engagement committee and is also a registered dietitian and the founder and CEO of Lauren Cornell Nutrition, a clinically based private practice here in Los Angeles that serves both pediatric and adult patients. Lauren specializes in sports and performance nutrition, as well as gastrointestinal diseases and disorders such as IBD, celiac disease, IBS, intestinal resection, and enteral nutrition support. And Lauren sits not only on a chapter advisory committee for our Crohn's and Colitis chapter, but also has been helping advocate for patients and individuals with Crohn's and ulcerative colitis and advocating for healthcare policy for an incredibly long time. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Lauren to talk about our long-term health maintenance for IBD Awareness Week.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Tiffany. And thank you guys for attending and taking the time to be here. So hopefully I can provide you with some helpful tidbits that will apply to you or your loved ones that are dealing with inflammatory bowel disease tonight. So this is just a quick program disclosure, essentially just letting you know that this is for education only. This is not medical advice. And obviously you need to discuss this, your own care and what's best for you with your medical team. Next slide, please. All right, so the overview of tonight's talk, we're going to discuss the diet's impact on inflammatory bowel disease and the role in management of the disease that nutrition plays. We're going to discuss goals of care in IBD, nutrient deficiencies and other areas to consider with IBD, how nutrition and lifestyle supports medical management of IBD, the importance of speaking with your IBD specialist, your registered dietitian, and your healthcare providers before making any changes to your medication or treatment plan. And that goes not just to the medication, but just treatment plan in general. Thanks so much. Next slide. All right. So does diet matter? Well, there was a study that's noted here in the footnote that was done on quite a few individuals. And what we found was 51% of those individuals asked indicated that diet was a, quote, important or extremely important part in controlling their symptoms. 42% indicated that food affects their symptoms a lot or severely. So those are pretty significant statistics. What I always mention when people ask this question, or if they question the role of nutrition or diet in their management of their disease, simply put, IBD is a disease of the digestive system. The digestive system's job is to digest food and absorb nutrients. So it would make sense that the diet influences disease outcomes and management, just simply put. Next slide. Okay. So what are the goals of care in IBD? This is across the board. This is anybody who's treating you for IBD, and just what are your goals too, ultimately, if you're somebody that has inflammatory bowel disease. The ultimate goal in care for IBD is to achieve what is called deep remission while improving the patient's quality of life, or your quality of life. So what is deep remission? That includes 3 different types of remission: clinical remission, histologic remission, and endoscopic remission. What that means, clinical remission is how does your disease present? What are your symptoms? And so, remission might be regular bowel movements, not excessive, not urgent, controlled, formed, complete bowel movements. For another person, that just might be drastic improvements. Like maybe you're going from having, 10 to 15 bowel movements a day, and we improve it to 5 to 6 bowel movements a day. And that is your clinical remission. Doing our best to remove hematochezia or blood in the stool, pain, other GI symptoms that you're experiencing associated with the inflammation. This would also, the clinical remission would also include improving serology, so improving like your C-reactive protein, maybe your SED rate, your fecal calprotectin levels, other indications of inflammation in your clinical testing. Histologic remission. So when we do your colonoscopies, or I should say when your gastroenterologist is doing those, they're doing a look around, a visible look around, and that's the endoscopic remission. So endoscopic would be when they're in there doing your scope, do they see any visible signs of inflammation or your disease in an active state? If not, they can say that that's endoscopic remission. Histologic would be that when they're also in there, they're doing biopsies and they're sending that to the lab. So if your pathology comes back and says, no signs of inflammation or active disease, if we achieve all those 3 things, that's deep remission. That's ultimately the goal here. Next slide, please. All right, so why a healthy diet and lifestyle benefits your disease state? Well, there's many reasons. It helps reduce and relieve GI symptoms and achieves bowel movement regularity. It reduces your chance of micronutrient deficiencies, and you're at an increased risk for micronutrient deficiencies in just having inflammatory bowel disease, which we'll talk about a little bit more in detail. It helps you maintain a healthy weight and body composition to support your active lifestyle. Healthy weight looks different for every person, and I would just say by definition, a healthy weight is kind of where your weight sits without effort. I don't necessarily think that needs to be adherent to sort of the BMI or the quote unquote ideal body weight. We're moving away from that as a healthcare community because we're realizing that that's not necessarily accurate. And there is a little bit more of a discussion about health at every size. So I just want to mention that in case that's a factor. I would say though, with IBD, what we're looking more towards is, are there any unintentional weight changes? And that's really what we're trying to maintain is your healthy weight without unintentional weight changes. It helps you to maintain adequate nutritional status, which supports a healthy immune system, balanced mental well-being. It helps maintain balanced energy levels, reduces your risk of other health conditions. It improves surgical outcomes, and it improves the body's response to medications. So those last two are pretty huge in terms of just affecting the other things that are going on in your treatment program. Next slide, please. All right. So malnutrition is at the core of this slide. Basically, what we're getting at here with this illustration is these other circles. So the diet-drug interaction, increased nutrient losses, an increase in nutritional needs, and then reduced nutrient intake. All of these things contribute to malnourishment or malnutrition, which is probably my number one factor as a registered dietitian on the team of somebody with inflammatory bowel disease to both prevent and treat immediately, because there are major health ramifications to malnourishment. And malnourishment, I should also mention, can happen in any size. So you could have somebody who perhaps registers as obese or overweight according to a BMI scale, and they could still be severely malnourished. So increased nutrient losses. This can happen from dehydration, from increased perspiration, which would mean fluid and electrolyte losses, overexertion. And I think we, think in the traditional sense of maybe exercise overexertion, but this can also happen in high heat climates or very cold climates, very dry climates as well, just changes in an environment in general, a lot of travel, so a lot of switching between atmospheres or switching between different climates. Overexertion can also happen, to students or people working, multiple jobs or trying to balance, a life of being a parent and a full-time job, maybe going back to school, all these things. Overexertion isn't just the physical sense. Increased nutritional needs. Overexertion also contributes to increased nutritional needs. So I think the most obvious example of that would be if somebody is an athlete or if someone is training for, maybe a race, if just you're a runner and you just enjoy running and you signed up for a 10K or a half marathon or something, you are overexerting or exerting yourself more so than normal. And so your nutrient needs would increase. Other ways that our nutritional needs go up, if you're somebody who's dealing with inflammatory bowel disease, if you have to undergo a surgery due to complications to your disease or treatment for your disease or surgery in general, actually, if it has nothing to do with your IBD, you have increased nutritional needs in those cases. Also weight loss, if you have unintentional weight loss, and arguably, if there's intentional weight loss, your nutritional needs may go up as well. If you have reduced nutrient intake, that can also lead to malnourishment. So this, of course, happens a lot in terms of IBD when individuals are experiencing a flare and maybe they're afraid to eat because they're afraid that if they eat, it will exacerbate their gastrointestinal symptoms, or it will exacerbate their flare, or they're unsure of how to eat through a flare. All of these things can affect the way that a person eats. Intentional or planned dietary restrictions, either due to outside influences that maybe don't pertain to the individual, like fad diets, or maybe just a peer says, hey, I'm eating this way, maybe you should too. And so you alter your diet, and there's increased restrictions on your diet because of that. And then you end up with a reduced nutrient intake as a result. So nausea and pain kind of goes with that in terms of what we already mentioned of the symptoms in a flare, or just in general kind of contributing to not wanting to eat as much, maybe in a moment or in general for a period of time. Loss of appetite. Sometimes that can happen due to symptoms, just losing your appetite for fear of not wanting to exacerbate symptoms, or because the pain is so bad that you just don't have an appetite to eat. Sometimes that can happen due to mental health, so worry, anxiety, depression. And sometimes that can happen for emotional reasons, or because you are busy and you forgot to eat or something like that. Travel can also reduce nutrient intake. Some way that might show up is perhaps, in a day of air travel where you're rushing from one thing to another, catching, the Uber to the airport, getting on a flight, you forgot to grab food, and maybe the food that they're serving is food that maybe doesn't really agree with your system on the flight. So you don't eat on the flight. And then next thing you know, most of the day has gone by and you haven't eaten yet. Or you're afraid to eat on a flight because you're afraid to have a sense of urgency episode or symptoms and have to use the restroom on the flight and you're embarrassed. So these are just a couple of scenarios. All these things contribute to malnutrition in somebody that has IBD, and they're all worth mentioning. And that's what my job is to help you navigate that so you don't end up with malnourishment. All right, next slide, please. Okay, common micronutrient deficiencies in IBD. The Crohn's and Colitis Foundation's website has wonderful nutrition resources for IBD, one of which is a wonderful handout called Common Micronutrient Deficiencies in IBD, and it goes into more detail. And so I highly recommend, if you haven't looked at that or any of the nutrition resources on the website, definitely do. But these are the big ones. So the B vitamins, I listed the 3 in particular that are more commonly deficient in patients with IBD. So that's B6, B9, although we typically call that folate or folic acid, and then vitamin B12. Vitamin D is a common micronutrient that is deficient in IBD. Calcium, iron, magnesium, and zinc. A lot of patients will ask me, how do I make sure that I'm getting enough of these? I mean, the first thing, and ideally, I would love for everyone to get their nutrition through their food. That would be ideal. But unfortunately, for various reasons, that might not be the best option, or it might not be the only option for somebody that's dealing with Crohn's disease or colitis. So there's a couple different ways if we have to supplement nutritional intake that we can do that. The traditional way that you think of is, through a pill form, like a tablet or a capsule of a nutrient supplement. Sometimes you can do sublingual, so that would go placed under the tongue and it gets absorbed that way. And that's one of the pictures that you're seeing here. We can do that through enteral or parenteral nutrition. So that would be nutrition support. So tube feeds, either intravenously, or it can be delivered straight to the gastrointestinal tract if need be. We can also do that through shakes. So these are orally consumed nutritional shakes. There's tons on the market. And I think probably at some point, a lot of you or your loved ones have dealt with these at some point. There are different nutritional approaches and nutritional therapy protocols that we can do with these. Sometimes it's just supplementing the normal oral solid diet with a shake or a couple of shakes a day. Sometimes it's a little bit more of a structured approach where we call that partial enteral nutrition, where maybe 50% of the daily food intake is coming in liquid form. So it's coming in a shake or a pureed soup or stew, a balanced nutrient intake. And then exclusive enteral nutrition can also be used for short periods of time. This is particularly effective in pediatric patients with Crohn's disease for reducing the risk of flare or for resolving a flare. And this would be where, for a period of time, somewhere between 6 and 12 weeks, usually, nutrition is exclusively coming from liquid formulas and taken in by mouth. So just a couple of things. Okay, so going into our vitamins. So I kind of broke these up a little bit just for the sake of room to the vitamins and then the minerals, although you don't need to necessarily know that too much because these are just all micronutrients under the umbrella of micronutrients or vitamins and minerals. So these are nutrients that don't necessarily provide us with caloric value, but they are, just because they're micro and not macro, meaning the macros provide us with calories, does not mean they're less important. They are incredibly important. And so these slides look word heavy, and I left them that way for a reason, because I want the impact to be visible of how much these little guys do. So let's just go through a few things, because I think hearing this stuff, it will start to set off the little aha moments for some of you. So why is B12 important? Vitamin B12. Well, it's used for energy production. It helps the body convert carbohydrates into fuel that we use for all of our bodily functions. It's integral in many cellular processes. Remember that as human beings, we're basically just a big old bag of billions of cells, right? So if our cells can't work right, we are just a collection of cells. So that's really important. The nervous system function is supported with B12 because it maintains the healthy nerve cells. Along with folic acid, which is B9, it helps to break down proteins, it helps produce red blood cells, and it helps the body utilize iron. That's why iron and vitamin B12 are often seen side by side when we're talking about anemia. It also helps produce SAMe, which is involved in immune function and mood regulation. Immune function is going to come up a lot because remember that IBD is an autoimmune condition. So as much as it affects the digestive system, it's also highly affecting the immune system, and it is a disease of the immune system. And remember that the immune system, majority of the immune system is living in your digestive system. And then finally, B12 helps with DNA and RNA production. B6 also helps with energy production and production of red blood cells and neurotransmitters, which help our brain communicate all kinds of things to our body, and protein metabolism, which is incredibly helpful. Folic acid, along with the other two B vitamins that I just mentioned, it helps break down proteins, red blood cell production. So you're seeing a trend here with the B vitamins probably. Cell replication, so incredibly important with reproduction, and if you're wanting to boost fertility and that sort of thing, that's one nutrient that we're really looking at. Vitamin D is integral in bone health. So vitamin D helps maintain sufficient levels of calcium and phosphorus, which are two minerals that are necessary for bone production. Immune health is supported by vitamin D as well. It helps reduce inflammation, so inflammatory bowel disease, that's really important when it comes to IBD. And other roles in immune support. Glucose metabolism relies on vitamin D, so that's energy, remember. Cell growth and gut health are both dependent on vitamin D. A couple things I wanted to mention too. There's something called hypocalcemic tetany that is a condition that can occur with vitamin D deficiency, and that causes involuntary muscle cramping and spasms. So you think about if we want the muscles of the digestive system to work properly, for bowel movement regularity, to reduce cramping and pain and that sort of thing, but not just of the muscles of the GI system, but the skeletal muscles, so that we, if you're somebody who, as part of your IBD, maybe deals with like arthritic pain or anything like that, we don't want to contribute to any more sort of skeletal muscle, skeletal structural symptoms. So that's just one thing to think about with vitamin D as well. There's also an association between vitamin D serology levels, so blood levels of vitamin D, lower than 12 ng per mLs. That's usually the unit that we're seeing in the United States to measure our vitamin D levels. So below 12, and there's a correlation between low vitamin D levels essentially and a 31% higher risk in developing colorectal cancer. So in short, you just need to know that, because it's one more reason to understand how important it is to maintain sufficient vitamin D levels and to get those checked regularly. Next slide, please. So now we're talking about the minerals. So that's calcium, magnesium, iron, and zinc. I'm going to go through these quickly just for the sake of time, but you guys can see these. You can screenshot it if you'd like. So calcium and magnesium are both integral in bone formation. Calcium is also, and magnesium actually, are both also electrolytes. So those help with the muscle contraction and release, which we need for a number of things. Nerve function and communication between the brain and all of the body parts is also reliant on electrolytes. So that's where calcium and magnesium also come into play. You can see the list of other things that magnesium is helpful for. Iron, this is a big one, and we actually got some questions about iron in advance. So this is one I want to spend a second on. Iron is integral in the transport of oxygen from the lungs to all of the tissues in the body. We need oxygen for literally every function in the body. So it's important, to say the very least. And it's one of the bigger micronutrients that come up in communication as a very common deficiency amongst people that are dealing with IBD, and we'll talk about why. Temperature regulation relies on iron, energy production, and metabolism. Yeah, thanks. And then zinc, very, very dependent. The immune system functions very dependent on zinc. We learned a lot more about that throughout the whole COVID pandemic. I think you probably remember people talking about increasing your intake of zinc and vitamin D and vitamin C to sort of stave off viral infections from COVID-19. And so I think it just educated us a little bit more on zinc's role in immune function and metabolism. And I put there specifically, think about energy in terms of zinc's role in metabolism. All right, next slide, please. So comorbidities associated with IBD. So this is just conditions that we are at increased risk for if you're somebody who's dealing with IBD. Cancer, deep vein thrombosis, something called PSC or primary sclerosing cholangitis, anxiety, depression, and then some rheumatologic conditions. I can go into a little bit more detail here. This slide is not to scare someone or to scare any of you. This is just, let me see real quick. I just want to make sure. Sorry, I just saw a little note. Are you guys, is everyone, I just want to make sure everyone's seeing that the slides are changing, okay? If anybody's having an issue with that, just let us know in the chat. So comorbidities associated with IBD. I can go into more detail about this, but this is not to scare anyone. This is just to make sure that you all understand, and there's great information on the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation's website about this as well. This is just to emphasize how important it is to make sure that you're doing all that you can to manage your condition and your health overall. By just doing that, you're reducing your own risk, even though you're at a slightly increased risk for developing these, just having the condition of IBD. You're reducing your own risk of developing these comorbidities. That's one of the main reasons why you would want to keep on top of your long-term health maintenance. Let me see if there's any like major points I want to make about that. I think that just in general, it's just a good idea to kind of just be aware of things. I think there's a little bit of an aha moment too when you're looking through these and understanding how these might come into play for you. Like if you're somebody that's dealing with like a psoriatic arthritis or any sort of rheumatic manifestations, peripheral arthritis or enthesitis, which is inflammation of the entheses, which are where the ligaments and the tendons attach to the bone. Like these are all things that we're at increased risk for if you have IBD. And so just being aware of that just helps you feel like, oh, this is kind of par for the course with this. And what are the things that I can do to help reduce my risk for this or help to treat those things? And you can talk to your medical team about that. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so how diet and lifestyle complement medical treatment of IBD. It is meant to be a complement. I would say in very rare cases, can you rely solely on nutrition to manage your condition without medication? And I want to be really clear about that. Overall, nutrition can help, healthier nutritional status leads to better surgical outcomes. There are many studies on that, but there's a few cited on this slide. Healthy nutrition status can improve the body's response to medications. A healthy, balanced diet also promotes stronger gut microbiome diversity, which supports immune system function, because remember that 80% of your immune system roughly lives in your gastrointestinal tract. There's a ton of other functions that the microbiome supports in the body's, just general all systems approach, but it's important for you to know. I just want to mention too that ARAS, you might have heard of that with your medical team, or if you're having to undergo surgery or have had, it stands for Enhanced Recovery After Surgery. It's a nutrition protocol that basically optimizes your nutrition before and after surgery, which then optimizes and improves your recovery and overall outcomes of surgery. So it's important to understand that and know that you and your medical team, your registered dietitian, your doctors are all on the same page about doing that if you are having to go through surgery to treat your Crohn's or colitis. Okay, next slide, please. All right, points to consider in your diet and lifestyle when managing IBD. This is kind of a checklist for you guys. So balanced and adequate nutrient intake. So what are your individual needs? It's really important to work with a registered dietitian, notably one that specializes in gastrointestinal disorders, that really understands how to help you learn what your individual nutritional needs are. Every single person is different. Literally, two identical twins have very different nutritional needs. So that said, it's really important that you work with professionals who are in the evidence-based realm. So that means somebody who is oathed or has a responsibility under their medical credentials to practice according to what research has said is effective and beneficial for you and doesn't do you harm, and helps you understand how that information applies to you and what your individual needs are. So I would not recommend finding this information on Instagram or social media, TikTok, any sort of environment like that. I would really recommend going to, specialists that are credentialed and that are looking at your individual needs and your individual health profile. How does your lifestyle alter your nutrient and hydration needs is a good question to ask yourself. So are you active? Where do you live? Are you someone who has a very busy lifestyle? Do you have a very sedentary lifestyle? Do you have other health conditions that require assistance or that require you to be sedentary, or that alter your lifestyle in any way that need to be considered here? Do you travel a lot? Do you have other people in your family that have other health conditions or dietary needs, and so you're all cooking a certain way, or all these things and factors come into play. Hydration is fluid and electrolytes. It's not just your water intake. Your electrolytes come into play, which is an integral piece in the health management when it comes to IBD specifically, because our GI system plays such a heavy role in management of or balance of our hydration in itself. Bone health. Knowing where your bone health is just at baseline. So simply put, have you ever had a bone density scan? Do you know what your bone density looks like? Do you have a family medical history of compromised bone density? Do you have osteopenia or osteoporosis in your family? It's really important to know where you stand with that. And it's just a matter of simply asking your doctor to schedule, a bone density scan or have your bone density tested to just know where you are and know where your trends are. And then, working with your registered dietitian or talking to your doctor about what medications might compromise your bone health, knowing what nutrition, what nutrient needs you individually might have to help optimize your bone health if that's necessary, which it kind of is necessary if you have IBD just at baseline. Immune system support. Remember, IBD is an autoimmune condition, so immune system support is always of utmost concern, and that's something we're always thinking of. And then stress and sleep. That 8 hours a night recommendation doesn't just come out of thin air. There's reasons for that, and really understanding how important that is and kind of structuring your lifestyle to make sure that you're preserving your sleep and really coveting a good night's sleep and having regular sleep, and reducing your stress is really, really important. Okay, next slide, please. So how do we measure this stuff? These are just a couple of metrics that you can use. So, and I kind of charted these so that you really could use this to kind of understand, what are the things that we need to be doing on a regular basis to just keep track, of, where we're at, what our trends are, and just always kind of knowing where we stand. Because sometimes you could be showing up clinically like, I'm good, my health is great, I have no clinical symptoms, I've gotten my bowel movements under control, they're all regular, but maybe on the inside, the disease is wreaking havoc. That happens sometimes. Typically, you'll have a clinical sign, but it could be, remember, we're trying to achieve those three sort of pieces of deep remission. So you really want to understand, not just from the outside, but on the inside, what's going on. So how do we do that? How do we understand if we're achieving balanced and adequate nutrient intake? Well, for starters, work with a registered dietitian to evaluate your intake itself. Keeping a food journal, using, an app that analyzes your nutrient intake to make sure you're getting enough calories, not participating in fad diets or restrictive diets that are unnecessary. just overall, like having a professional help you to evaluate your overall intake, and that would include your hydration as well. If you have any unintentional weight changes, that can sometimes be an indication of that your nutrient intake is not balanced or is inadequate. Unexplained muscle loss. So sometimes this can be, this can show up as sort of like a compromisation in your strength. But your doctor or your registered dietitian can do, we call them nutrition focused physical exams, where we can test your muscle strength. This is not muscle testing like done in the alternative medicine sort of realm, but this is actual like evidence-based testing of your muscle strength by your physician or registered dietitian. But unexplained muscle loss can also come up if we did like a DEXA scan or some other way of an evidence-based way of evaluating your body composition so that we can see if there's been actual muscle loss. And there are some other ways, like sometimes, for example, swallow function can be compromised in somebody who's drastically losing muscle because, the functions of the throat and everything involved in swallowing requires muscle strength. So just little things like that can kind of come up. Nutritional status. So, just overall, like, what are your nutrient levels looking like? The metrics that we use for balanced and adequate nutrient intake apply here, but also some blood work. So I always tell my patients, you have to be your own advocate and know what to ask for on your routine blood tests. If you have inflammatory bowel disease, it's important to regularly have your iron panel checked, not just your iron, but the whole panel. So that would include your total iron binding capacity, your ferritin, your transferrin, your percent iron saturation, and then iron itself, because all those little pieces tell us a bigger picture of what's going on. Your vitamin D levels and your blood work, having those checked regularly, your electrolytes, so that would be your calcium, your magnesium, your sodium, your potassium, among other things. Your B vitamins, so we can check your folate in your blood, we can check your B12, we can also check your B6 and a few others if we need to. Your hydration, how do we know if you're hydrated? Well, first things first, you can track your water intake, and you can work with your registered dietitian to help them calculate what your daily water intake needs are in fluid ounces. So you can really get clear on measuring that and knowing how to get that, sufficiently met. Are you experiencing a lot of cramping, muscle cramps, Charlie horses in the middle of the night that are waking you up? Those are always fun. You hear about eating the banana that's high in potassium, which is an electrolyte, which is part of your hydration. And that should help your cramping going away, but really wanting to get professionally evaluated for that is helpful. Low energy can sometimes just be due to dehydration. Dark urine, this is not the only metric though. We don't want to just rely on having clear or very light colored yellow urine as an indication that we're hydrated. That's not the only thing. We do want to just be clear on what your hydration needs are and understand how to measure those and make sure we're meeting those every day. Bone health, we talked about the bone density scan or a DEXA scan, we'll include that as well. Immune health, how often are you getting sick? What are your energy levels like? How fast do your wounds heal when you have like a scrape or a cut or a bruise or something like that? Are you bruising often? These things all help us understand different things about your nutritional status. Your sleep and your stress. What's your mental health status? There's the gut-brain interaction, meaning that your brain and your GI tract communicate with each other in a bi-directional communication pathway. So mental health and stress and sleep plays a vital role in your health management if you have IBD. Your physical tension, just are you noticing that you're keeping tension in your shoulders, in your hands, things like that? For me, I have a compromised neck issue. So my neck hurting is sort of my indication that I might be holding a little bit more tension than normal. Tracking your sleep. Are you getting 8 hours a night of sleep? How can you get more if you're not? All these things are helpful. Last slide, please. All right, so in summary, again, this is kind of a little bit of a checklist for you. You want to make sure that you are a compliant and self-advocating patient. This does not mean that you just go along with what your medical team says to do and you don't ask questions. That's not it at all. You should be well informed. So you guys attending this type of webinar helps you be your best self-advocate. But taking your medications as directed or asking questions if you want to change things or you have questions about the dosage or or, being able to rely on your medical team for that stuff. Staying current on your routine assessment, like where are you at with your scopes? What is your medical team recommending? How often you get scopes done? Where are you with that? Are you on top of scheduling those and maintaining those? So you understand what's going on inside with your disease state as well. Your C-reactive protein levels, your fecal calprotectin levels, your SED rates, your serum levels overall, your blood work. Show up for your infusions if your medical team has recommended that you do some sort of infusions, whether that's medical infusions, iron infusions, any sort of nutrient infusions, and then calling your medical team immediately when you experience changes in your conditions so that they can quickly schedule you for an appointment to have you be seen and alter your care plan accordingly. Managing a healthy lifestyle. So getting enough rest, eating a well-balanced diet, exercising regularly, just moving your body on a regular basis. And that can look different for every person. Monitoring and managing your stress levels and hydration. So regarding a balanced diet, one that includes carbohydrates, we need carbs and we need the fiber that is under the carb umbrella. That's incredibly important for reducing risk for flares in people with inflammatory bowel disease statistically. Protein, healthy fats, omega-3 fatty acids, and in particular, when we talk about fats, are anti-inflammatory and very necessary. We want to get a lot of antioxidants from deeply colored fruits and vegetables. So these are all, balanced diet's key. For regular exercise, just be sure to replete your nutrients and your hydration and don't overexert yourself. For monitoring and managing your stress, behavioral health modalities, for some, this might be considered a completely separate category and need more emphasis than others because it has such an impact on gut health. For hydration, remember, hydration is fluid plus electrolytes. It's not just water. Being on top of changes in your clinical and histological trends. So you can track your food, your symptoms, and your bowel movements. That's really helpful to understand if there's going to be changes in that. There is an app, and I'm forgetting the name of it, but there's an app that I have a few patients of mine with IBD that they use to track their symptoms and their serology and their test results in that app, just to kind of be really clear on what their trends are. Let me see if I can try to get the name for you. I messaged one of my patients to get the name. Hopefully it'll come in while I'm still here. Meeting with your team on a regular basis, keeping up with your regular medical appointments with your specialists and your primary care physician and gastroenterologist. Navigating life changes. So there's different seasons and travel and big changes, maybe new career or new family members, or perhaps maybe a family loss, unfortunately, daylight savings and changes in circadian rhythms when you travel. These all make a big impact on IBD. Staying abreast of resources, changes in research and treatment options that may optimize your lifestyle and your treatment plan to make your life easier. Crohn's and Colitis Foundation is a wonderful resource for this, and so are your support groups. And finally, just getting involved with your community. This provides perspective, peace of mind, and just knowing you're not alone and that other people are going through exactly what you're going through. And maybe there's just things that you can't find on a website or in a book or even on social media, where you can really relate to people who are going through your same things with your same condition. And I think that's why these support groups are so fantastic. And just, they're fun. So take advantage of your community. So we are at a question portion, and we got quite a few really great ones. So I'm just going to launch right into that. So a couple of questions that we got. I'm just going to kind of whip through these. Is a low sugar, gluten-free diet actually helpful in minimizing inflammation, or are either of these effective in general for IBD? I'm going to separate those two out. There's a low sugar diet and a gluten-free diet. Let me talk about gluten-free first. If you have celiac disease, which is an autoimmune condition that is triggered by the presence of gluten, so it's similar, it's thought of as a gluten allergy. It's not actually a gluten allergy, but the only treatment for celiac disease, and it's a serious treatment, is a gluten-free diet, very strict gluten-free diet. If you have celiac disease, I'm speaking differently to you, then in that case, you have no choice but to have a gluten-free diet. You do not have celiac disease by default if you have inflammatory bowel disease. They are two different things. So if you just have inflammatory bowel disease, so Crohn's disease or colitis, and you're just wondering if a gluten-free diet might actually benefit, the short answer is no. And I think I made this really clear throughout my presentation that, I always say my goal as a GI dietitian is to provide my patients with the least restrictive diet while best managing their symptoms, because my goal is to remove the risk of malnourishment at all costs. Anytime there is a dietary restriction, so if we pull out an entire nutrient or an entire food group by going gluten-free or dairy-free or removing things that have sugar in them, for example, and that's a little bit of a different thing, but or if we decide to go plant-based, vegetarian, vegan, nothing wrong with any of these things, but make sure that they're for good reason. So if you decide to go vegetarian for ethical reasons, or because you just heard it's a healthy way to go, I would say always have a conversation with your specialist and your medical professional first to make sure that that works best for you. As a registered dietitian, I can support any of those dietary choices as long as they make sense. So I would not support going gluten-free unless there's a reason for it, like celiac disease. If you don't tolerate foods that have gluten in them, it's likely that it's actually a different compound in the food and it's not gluten. A GI dietitian can help you to better understand that. And the good news is you can still consume foods that have gluten in them. You can just alter them a little bit so that you don't get the symptoms, but you still get the nutrients. So it's really great. And I think if you have a conversation with anybody that has celiac disease that does unfortunately have to avoid gluten entirely, they'll tell you that with celiac disease, you also have an increased risk for iron deficiency and other comorbidities. And it's a real bummer because you miss out on all these nutrients that come with foods that contain gluten. And it's a longer answer than that, but the short answer is I would only recommend removing gluten from your diet if you absolutely have to. And even if you are intolerant, but don't have celiac, but are intolerant to foods that may contain gluten, it's probably a different compound in those foods. And it helps to work with a registered dietitian to understand that. Low sugar, there is some research to show that packaged processed foods and some other ingredients, additives and such that are found in those foods may promote inflammation. And so by way of some of those foods containing additional sugar, sometimes those foods get a bad rep for that. Sugar on its own is actually really nicely absorbed because it's a nice even combination of fructose and glucose, which gets nicely absorbed into the cell and it helps other things get into the cell. So I wouldn't say sugar is such a culprit. I would just say it's important to be clear on how much you need and then understand just, when we're eating, a lot of treats and desserts and things like that, one, are we stimulating the GI tract a little bit, which kind of attracts water into the GI tract and can cause us some symptoms. But also are we taking up space in our appetite and our daily intake where we could actually make more room for other nutritious foods? So I would look at it that way. The second question is discuss the role of a whole food plant-based diet to help manage IBD and IBS symptoms. Those are two different things. So I'm going to focus on IBD. IBS is irritable bowel syndrome, very different. So I'm just going to focus on IBD for the sake of time. Whole food being different than plant-based, but whole food plant-based. So meaning like a vegetarian diet where there's minimal animal products, but whole food meaning like not a whole lot of processed ingredients as well. I will say indirectly, there's research to promote or to show that a moderate to high fiber diet reduces the risk specifically of flares in Crohn's disease patients, and it's pretty significant. But fiber can also help greatly with the health of somebody with colitis, just the same. Fiber is arguably one of my favorite nutrients for so many different reasons. But I would say, fiber comes from plant-based foods. So by adopting, including even just more plants in your diet, even if you're not plant-based and you're still consuming animal products, you're probably going to increase the nutrient value of your foods that way. You don't necessarily have to go entirely plant-based unless this is something that you're exploring for other reasons or for health reasons, sure. But I would say, remember that this is a dietary restriction. So you do want to work with a professional, i.e. a registered dietitian, to help you understand how you can still make sure that that nutrient intake is balanced. You're getting enough protein, healthy fats, carbohydrates, et cetera, through that diet, even though, and just knowing, how to make sure you're still getting enough iron in your diet, B vitamins in your diet. These are nutrients that are predominantly found in animal-based foods. They're absolutely possible to get them through plant-based resources or through supplementation. I would just say, first and foremost, you need to find out what would be best for your individual needs in your disease state. So I hope that answers that question. These are great questions. They're just very loaded, so I'm hoping I'm doing them justice. Somebody said, I'm curious what diets you see most effective for those in remission, and if being on a biologic medication impacts this at all. That's kind of a two-part question, so I'm going to answer the nutritional component of that as best I can. The Mediterranean diet is probably the most studied and consistently shown to be the most effective in helping to reduce inflammation in inflammatory bowel disease. What's awesome about that is that the Mediterranean diet is also very much the least restrictive diet of the ones that we kind of see a lot in studies for IBD. So other diets that we sometimes see are like the specific carbohydrate diet, which it's controversial in the evidence that it has in support of it. And I would say it's not one that I recommend often, because I think that the research that does show some benefits to it is a little bit misleading, because it's not accounting for other reasons why parts of the diet might be helpful, and it's just unnecessarily restrictive. There's a couple other diets that are out there. Autoimmune protocol, which is not evidence-based, but there is some great research. I'd say Mediterranean diet is the one that's sort of like overarching, pretty consistent with its research benefits for IBD. And then if being on a biologic medication impacts this at all, well, I think that's a conversation to have with your doctor. As a registered dietitian, that is out of my scope of practice to inform any individual about any changes to their medication. So if I'm working with a patient, that's not something that I'm going to have a discussion with them about, but I can support medical changes or changes to medication, or I can support goals for the patient. And I would say it's always beneficial to communicate what your goals are for your medication with your physicians, so that everybody's on the same page. And you are the CEO, you're your advocate in terms of what you want. But biologics are not just haphazardly prescribed. Those are for a reason, and they can be life-saving. So I would just definitely have those conversations with your doctor. Why is iron deficiency consistently an issue in those with IBD? Or so to my knowledge, the person says, and how have you seen this treated and supplemented if absorption is the issue? That's a great question. So like any micronutrient deficiency or nutrient deficiency, iron deficiency is an issue with those with IBD for a couple of reasons. You have to remember that the intestinal walls are the sites in our body where our nutrients are absorbed. So our nutrients are absorbed through the intestinal walls, and then they go into our bloodstream and into our body. So if inflammatory bowel disease, if your disease state is active and the walls of your intestines are inflamed, that means the nutrient absorption sites are inflamed and compromised. So your nutritional absorption is going to be compromised. So even if you were eating a sufficient amount or eating a ton of great iron resources in your diet, for example, you might not be able to absorb them correctly depending on your disease state. Conversely, we talked about this earlier, if your nutrient intake is subpar, like you're not eating enough food, or you're not eating the right sources of food or balanced diet because you're afraid that what you eat might be compromising or might be exacerbating your symptoms or causing your symptoms, or your appetite is low, or you've received some outside information about, trying a restrictive diet or a fad diet like keto or paleo or something like that, that's just not appropriate for you. We oftentimes see nutrient deficiencies like iron deficiency in IBD patients because their intake is compromised. And then there might be other reasons why the iron absorption is not happening sufficiently. So to treat that and supplement it, a couple of ways that I go about that. One, I educate my patients on sources of iron in their diet. also sources of vitamin C in their diet, because vitamin C increases iron absorption. It helps support the iron absorption. So it's nice to have those two together. I also educate my patients on, okay, if we're eating a sufficient dietary amount, I can see that there's probably a good amount of iron and vitamin C in there. And we're still like dealing with low iron levels, and, you know, your disease state looks to be well managed. It might be that we need to do something outside and supplement. So we can try oral supplementation. There's sublingual supplementation of iron. And we would do so from forms of iron that are better on the tummy. That would be chelated iron supplements. And if the oral supplementation is not working, we then would go with iron infusions, and those can be coordinated for you by your medical team. And you just go to an infusion center and have iron infusions, and they're usually pretty well tolerated. There's many different ways that you can kind of supplement your iron. So it's just a matter of talking to your registered dietitian. Another question that came in, someone said, my 16-year-old has Crohn's disease. What is a good source of data that keto and or Mediterranean diet will help reduce inflammation to share with our teenager who believes in science and feels the food approach is irrelevant? Okay, so there's so many pieces to this question that I want to address. I would say, I think what they're asking is, what are some good sources of data to support that any type of dietary therapy will help reduce inflammation? So I think I've included quite a bit in this presentation that really kind of give you a thorough look at why nutrition is so important for management of health in IBD. So I think that goes without saying. Keto diet is for the most part, is a fad diet. The clinical use of a ketogenic diet, the only use I have for it as a registered dietitian practicing evidence-based, is for pediatric patients with epilepsy, and it would be short-term use. And the clinical version of a keto diet is very different than the mainstream sort of fad diet keto. I don't have a place for it in IBD. The Mediterranean diet does have evidence to support its efficacy in reducing inflammation for Crohn's disease. There are lots of studies on that, but I think I went into that a little bit. I love that your teen believes in science. I would not separate science from nutrition. So I have a master's degree in nutritional science. As an evidence-based practitioner, the reason I am a dietitian is because nutritional science is effective in treating most diseases. So I appreciate so much that your teen believes in science, and if they believe in science, they should believe in the effectiveness of nutrition to help manage their condition, simply put. And then we got a couple of questions coming in live. Do I still have time for that, guys? I think we're wrapping up pretty soon. Let me see.
You're good, Laura, and we can go a couple minutes over. There's been a lot of really great questions in the Q&A tonight.
Okay, perfect. Let me see if I can pull those up. Let's see. Somebody asked about probiotics. Do probiotics really make a difference? And I think I got another couple questions about probiotics. Simply put, the research on probiotics in general is inconclusive. There have been some promising results in some clinical trials for specific strains pertaining to specific GI symptoms or specific GI conditions. None that I'm aware of for IBD in general overall yet. And this is obviously my area of research that I'm obligated to keep up with. I will be honest with you, most of the time these days, I'm not recommending probiotics. There's so much of a pill burden already for somebody with inflammatory bowel disease between medications and supplementing nutrients that I don't want to add to that. I don't want to add to the cost, and I don't want to add to the physical pill burden, the amount of pills you have to take every day. Not to mention just one more substance that your body has to ingest, digest, metabolize, and sift through, unless I am certain that it's going to be effective for you. And the bottom line is with probiotics, I'm just not, from a research perspective and from a practical perspective. Oftentimes, if a patient comes to me and they're already on a probiotic, I'll ask them, hey, did you notice a significant difference when you started to take that probiotic? If they're like, oh my gosh, it changed my life, which I'd say is probably rare, then I'll say, great, by all means, stay on that. If not the case, which I'd say majority of the time they're like, I'm not really sure. Then I'd say, all right, well then let's take that off your plate and out of your wallet. You know, we don't need to do that anymore. So in short, I'm not recommending them too often. But that said, if you are taking an antibiotic and you are prone to yeast infections as a female, you could increase your intake of probiotic rich foods while you're taking an antibiotic just to help stave off yeast infections. That's a different sort of like cultural imbalance that happens when we do the, take antibiotics and things like that. So that could be, something to pay attention to. Let's see. Yeah, let's see. Oh, let's see. Somebody said, I've had a lot of success with reducing flares by cutting out gluten and vegetables. And they said in parentheses, so sad in my diet. What do you think about this? So when you are in a flare, it's tricky because everybody's flares are a little bit different, but essentially what's going on is the intestinal walls are inflamed. They're ulcerative. So in some cases they are raw and there's bleeding. You are in pain. And you're experiencing other symptoms like perhaps sense of urgency, diarrhea, fecal incontinence, an increase in the quantity of your bowel movements every day. You're confined to a toilet. It's not fun. So in those cases, reducing your fiber temporarily during a flare to just sort of get you out of the flare can be necessary. And remember that plant-based foods, so grains, vegetables, fruits, nuts and seeds, legumes, these are all some forms of fiber, right? Or sources of fiber. So I think it's probably that you're benefiting from the reduction in the fiber during a flare by removing, gluten and certain vegetables. I don't think you necessarily have to remove those things. Instead, you could change the texture of them or the way that you're getting them. So maybe like pureeing your vegetables in a soup, blenderizing them, softening, like very softly cooking them, could help with gluten. You could change and again, it might, it's a temporary change perhaps as you get through the flare. And then when you're on the other side of it, you can kind of very gradually kind of increase your fiber and kind of go back to kind of increasing your intake to back to normal. But you could, kind of go to eating like sort of refined sources of gluten for a temporary period of time, just to get the nutrients from those foods and still enjoy those foods, but maybe, without the symptoms. So hopefully that is helpful. And I am just told that we should probably wrap up. So you guys have so many great questions. I hope I was able to answer as many as possible, just to help. And hopefully like even just facets of those answers will help you. But thank you guys so much for your time, and I will pass it back to Tiffany.
Thank you everyone so much for joining us this evening. And I really have to give such great kudos to Lauren for lending her time and sharing her expertise with us. I know there's so many great questions in their chat, and Lauren did such a great job in trying to answer them all, but we will be sure to email everyone afterward with the recording of this webinar and hopefully get some more questions answered. We hope to see you tomorrow for the part 2 in our series at 7 p.m. with UCI Digestive Health. If you have any questions or would like to learn more about what the Greater Los Angeles and Orange County chapter is doing on a local level, we hope you can visit us at our website here. And also I have my email in the chat box as well. But thank you guys all so much for your time. And we'll thank you so much for helping us make IBD visible this Crohn's and Colitis Awareness Week.